So, welcome to Predictive Analytics. For all you product managers here in 2025 and beyond, we're going to talk about going from reactive guesswork to proactive strategy here. And we're glad you joined us. As Kenny said, I'm Dean Peters, a principal consultant and trainer with Productside. I've been here for about 3 years. Before that, 20 years of product management, doing a lot with analytics and AI in a variety of fields. And I'm located right outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, in the township known as Apex, North Carolina. Kenny, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm also a consultant and trainer here at Productside for a little longer than Dean. And then before that, I've been a product manager for a little longer than Dean too, probably 25 years, 30 years maybe. Believe it or not, I started my product management career at Kentucky Fried Chicken. Have since worked for places like Amazon and Microsoft. And yes, I am located just outside Seattle in wonderful Bellevue, Washington, and happy to be with you. I will be your moderator, and Dean's going to be our main lead on this webinar. So he'll drive most of the time, but I'll talk a little bit and cause confusion
So,
as we go along.
yeah, why don't we tell them a little bit more about Productside?
Yeah, so Productside's a sponsor for this webinar. We both work there. I'll welcome and introduce Productside a little bit. As I said, the team behind today's webinar. Productside, we know that product managers have a very difficult job, right? Delivering products uh, is not hard. It's not an easy job. We want to create products that people love, align stakeholders, make sure we understand what customer needs are, and manage endless backlogs. And that's why we're here, right? We're trying to be your outcome-driven product partner. Again, we don't just provide solutions, we tailor them to the unique needs, right? We provide complete solutions, everything from assessment to training to coaching along the way. And as I noted, we tend to tailor that expertise. We know that in each company's and each individual challenges are unique, so we strive to make sure that we meet the needs of your specific company or challenges that you're facing. And we have a whole bunch of people like Dean and myself that have spent a lot of time being product managers. And we do two things. One, we act as sort of extensions of your team as we work through the transformation. And we are fundamentally obsessed with your success as product management teams.
Yes, we do that by answering questions, right?
Yes, yes, we do. We have lots of questions. So please do those. The first question I always get asked is, can I watch this recording later? The answer is yes. We record all the webinars. We will send you a link to that recording so you can share it with your friends that may not have been able to make it. And during the session, if a question comes up, feel free to go ask it. I will have no problem interrupting Dean with using the Q&A feature. So, if you come up with a question when something we say confuses you, feel free to ask it. Also, don't stop there. We have a chat feature where you connect with other folks on this webinar. Just put your comments, your thoughts, ask your colleagues questions, share your own experiences, or just cheer each other on. It's a good place for you to learn from. So let's keep the energy up. Don't hold back. This is your time to get the most out of
Yeah.
today's session.
And it doesn't just end here, does it?
No, we have a whole bunch of places for you to connect with Productside. So there's two places here. One is you can connect with us on LinkedIn. If you take a little QR code on the left, you'll have a chance to do things like, learn best practices for product management, learn when our next webinar is coming up, even though we'll tell you at the end, and really have an opportunity to network with other professionals and other folks that are connected to the product management field. We also, on the right, you can see a QR code for our weekly newsletter. To start to inject some product caffeine into your inbox. We basically take a whole week of product noise and put it into a 5-minute read at the end of each week. Again, we'll bring up not just market moves, funding rounds, interesting data points that actually matter to product managers. We promise not to use clickbait and rely on things like ready to deploy insights. You'll also get first dibs on new things we create like templates or cheat sheets or webinars or interesting free seats that we sometimes give out to our training. So keep
Yes.
yourself one step ahead.
All righty. So we got a lot to talk about today in a short time.
Yeah, so dive in, Dean.
All right. So we're going to start with some housekeeping. Well, we just did the housekeeping. So we're going to get into the human stories first because we always like storytelling and being product managers. Then we're talking about predictive outcomes. We are going to do some demos. It's going to be some little bit of exploration and just showing you how you can get your arms around this yourself as well. And then maybe talk about some key takeaways and some Q&A. So let's just dive right into this topic of predictive analytics. And let's talk about the what's hiding in plain sight. There is notice that's a B, not an M, right after that dollar amount, Kenny,
Yeah,
of
it's a lot of money.
opportunities. A lot of money on the table hiding in plain sight. That's a number. I think it came from McKinsey, and there's also a few other sources. They're basically saying somewhere around this number, there's about 82 billion in predictive analytics opportunities. So while our friend generative AI sucks all the oxygen out of the room, let's not forget about predictive analytics because it's been around for with us for years. In fact, if you look, everyone's sort of zeroed in here on generative AI, but you'll notice that it is basically evolved. It evolved as people combined deep learning and natural language processing, and before that became experts in machine learning, and before that with statistical metrics, or in statistical modeling. So you can see that predictive analytics, especially around the area of statistical modeling and machine learning, this is where it happens and still happens quite a bit and has happened in the past. In fact, it's been around for quite some time. These statistical models were great for forecasting probabilities. Some of the earliest uses that I read about, well, there was one in 1530, but the one I always go back to is in World War II. Some of our first computers were trying to predict weather patterns. And so, going back almost, what was that be, about 80 years ago, used quite a bit these statistical models. Now, of course, these became very fragile because they were all hard coded in lots of ways. And they just said, hey, what if we use data, to instead of a code? And that's where machine learning started evolving there. And you'll notice then from there is deep learning, and then from there, natural language processing, generative AI. But you'll also notice these two vectors here. Kenny, you notice that I got determinism versus
Yep.
creativity. So what is this chart telling you when you look at this?
That we add more creativity with using less determination over time.
Right, which means if you want very deterministic, very accurate predictions based off of data, would you use generative AI?
Probably not.
Probably not, because it's very low on the deterministic scale and very high on the creative. And the last thing we need is weather, factory floors, and other things saying like, well, why don't we just go ahead and, generate a nice story and has no basis in reality. No, what we're trying to do with predictive analytics is again, keep ourselves from, make forecasts and probabilities that are actually accurate in data. So you see it's all the way up here on this end of the spectrum. And this is why it's an important area of product management, or a modality you might hear it calling it, that we shouldn't forget. Now, here's the best thing. Predictive analytics has been AI under different names. In fact, we were joking, Kenny. It's the one technology that we're still working with today that's older than the both of us, which don't ask us the years, folks. We're not giving that away. But yeah, any of these things look familiar for you? What was the first year you heard the term observability with operational performance, or when was the first time you heard churn analysis? Would that be in this millennia or the previous?
Probably the previous one.
Yeah, I think the
We
first
worried
time I
about
heard
churn.
about observability was in the, because before I was in product management, I did about, 12, 15 years of programming. And I think I heard about some of these, like fraud detection back in the 80s and the 90s, just to, like I said. So you've probably heard of it under these different names and under different guises here, such as preventative maintenance, supply chain, predictions, A/B testing, demand forecasting. So you've probably heard it. In fact, in the chat here, you might want to sit there and put in when is the first time you heard some of these terms. And while people maybe are putting that in the chat, could you would you have a synonym for deterministic?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, I'm going to use, and probably not the best. Well, actually, it's probably better when you want accuracy. All right. When two plus two must always equal
Equal
four,
four.
that's deterministic. when you go to generative AI, sometimes 2 + 2 = 7. All right, for whatever reason. Okay.
Hallucinate a
Uh,
little.
well, really just hallucinations, just a little. Yeah. So if you want no hallucinations or low hallucinations and very high accuracy, that is a deterministic system. It's giving you very determined signals there. All righty. And of course, there's lots of hypes and myth about this. I've heard these. It's too complex for non-technical product managers. That may have been true earlier, but that's rubbish now. Generative AI makes predictive analytics obsolete. Uh, no, it doesn't. Um, only works with perfect data. It's too slow. It's just fancy reporting. No, the truth is, it actually turns hunches into measurable and more accurate data informed predictions. It helps us work proactively. It's so funny because when I work with other places, I talk about what are we going to do to add proactive telemetry? And everyone's eyes glaze over like, what the heck is that? Now, if you've worked in the Azure camp and you've had some work with in DevOps, then you're probably familiar with all their telemetry tools. And what they're trying to do is help you be a little more proactive in getting out in front of issues before the customer gets out in front of you. You can make A/B testing smarter. You can transfer, do all sorts of things with resource allocation. If you've enjoyed, French fries at McDonald's, if you've, gotten the coffee you want at Starbucks, if you've, found that the traffic patterns are working in your favor, doesn't always work that way, but find all the lights turn green for you. A lot of that has to do with various acts of predictive analytics there. So with that, Kenny, I know you got some stories
I
on
do,
how
I
you've
do.
worked with it. So I want to hear them.
So, yeah, so I've worked with predictive analytics for like at least the last 20 or 25 years. I was actually working with a startup that we formed in about 2005 with the goal of creating um, accurate real-time and predictive traffic on roadways across the world. And so we did it by the traditional model was they put little sensors in the road so they could figure out how
Hmm.
long it took a car to go over the sensors. We changed it a little bit and we actually got data from vehicles that told us where they were, what direction they were heading, and how fast they were going. We used that data to try to create traffic. But we needed some predictive analytics. Why? Well, a couple of things. One is, so let's create a scenario. Let's say let's say I've got a whole bunch of data on a roadway and I've got a couple of cars going 60 miles an hour and I've got one traveling at 0 miles an hour. So what should I do? Should I just go, I've got three cars, two are going 60, one's going 0. Should I just average it and say the average speed on that road is 40 miles an hour? What do you think, Dean?
Yeah, sure. Why not? Let's go with an average here, and let's make that average work for all seasons.
No, I don't think so. We've got some predictive analytics. We're able to analyze and say, based on some historical data, we know that that guy going 0 is probably sitting by the side of the road. So let's just average the two that are 60 and call the speed on the road 60 miles an hour. Now I got another scenario where I've got several cars going 60 miles an hour and I got several other cars going 30 miles an hour, right? So they just average it
Uh,
up again and go and create and say the traffic on this road is going about 45 miles an hour.
sure, let's do averages, man.
No,
Those
don't do
always
that.
work under all circumstances.
I got some predictive analytics. When I've looked at this road in the past, I see that what happens is there's probably a bimodal distribution of traffic going on this road. Why might that
There,
be? Well, turns out there's an HOV lane on this road, right? That one's going 60 miles an hour. Everybody else is going 45 miles an hour. I now actually have to create two incidents of two speeds on this road because there actually are two speeds going on based on the models that I've got. Now I want to actually go create, okay, Dean, you're not commuting now. You're gonna commute at 6 o'clock tonight. How do I figure
well,
out
yeah.
how do I tell you what traffic's going to be like so I can route you the best way when you go to the Charlotte Hornets game tonight?
Well, you just used to take a weekly average, right? You're just going to take all the weekly average of the speeds, and maybe
No,
you just use some math or use an Excel spread. No, that doesn't work.
no, we start there, right? We know historically what on a Wednesday night traffic might look like in Raleigh, North Carolina. But turns out that again, there's that UNC basketball game going on tonight, right? We've got to actually build that into our analysis,
Oh,
leverage
but
and
wait,
understand what happened historically when there was a UNC basketball game going
and
on.
or it's even worse when you're going to an NC State game.
Yeah,
and the NC State Fair is happening at the same time.
you got it.
Yeah, and that only happens once a week, but oh my goodness, yeah, it can create some. Yeah, so yeah, there's some.
So we're using predictive analytics to help us predict what traffic's going to look like on your commute to downtown Raleigh tonight.
Right. And it's not just red lights and stoplights. I mean, think about it. People in emergency services, right, are
Oh
going to be
yeah,
using that to understand what,
yeah.
because based on the density and type of traffic, how many EMTs do I have to have? How many police do I have to have ready to roll? What type of people, what type of other equipment do I have to have? What alternative routes? News organizations use that. So it actually, good predictive analytics has a pretty wide footprint here. It's not just for traffic lights and flow. It's actually, again, impacts entire societies, and a lot of cities and a lot of municipalities rely on it heavily.
So this isn't new. It's been going on for at least the last 25, 30 years, at least from our perspective, in terms of leveraging. We'd heard the word AI, but we weren't using AI back then.
Yeah.
We were
Well,
using things that people call Bayesian models. Anybody ever use Bayesian models? Yeah. It was basically predictive analytics.
yeah, and I got some similar stories here. I think my first introduction to it was still when I was a software engineer in the late 80s. And I was told that, hey, we've got these seismic pots in the ground along the US Mexico border right around El Paso. And what you need to do is take these signals that are bouncing out of this little pot, hitting a microwave up on top of a mountain, and then reflecting that into a center, and basically mapping these and then also predicting these. Now, one of the things that we had to predict was whether the current path, because you have these series of seismic pots. And so as they triggered each one on a path, you had to figure out that were they taking a straight path or a wandering path. Now, why do you suppose straight versus wandering was important in terms of predicting? Any thoughts, Kenny?
No, beats me.
Got a lot of animals. Animals tend
Uh-huh.
to wander. Humans tend to run on a straight line because they're running along a riverbed or something like that. So you had that. Later, while working with things like in more of an industrial setting with industrial IoT, we were capturing data off of things like oil wells and off of wind generation mills. And the thing about the wind generation mills was some interesting data. All right. In fact, they were able to do predictive analytics using cardiology, where basically as they listened and they got a signature of how the windmill sounds when it's healthy, and it actually has a very cardio type of like boom 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 type of sound here. And when it gets irregular there, they can actually understand from different patterns they captured. Not only is the windmill getting sick, but how is it getting sick, and what type of person do we need to send out and when? So again, it's used in a variety of. We've used it with patient systems. I think where I used it the most was in the early '90s in the first frequent passenger system known as INSPASS. You can look that up on Wikipedia. INSPASS was just the first biometric identification for frequent travelers. Yes, I was the lead engineer on that. And one of the things we actually had to do was run simulations using patterns of traffic of people coming into Newark Terminal C, which was our first place. And like, how many people would we have coming through this system? Possibly using the system when 3 or 4 planes arrived in short frequency of each other to Terminal C, where a lot of people are coming in from other countries. And so again, we use predictive analytics to help us understand how do we scale this system? How do we get the system ready for an onslaught of people because it's very surge-like type of traffic there. So again, been used for years, but I'm interested in our audience. I think it's time for a poll. Kimberly, would you be so kind as to light up this poll? And I want to hear what type of problems you're currently solving with acts of predictive analytics. Pick the one that best suits your need, or most impacts you there, and we'll just get some sort of thoughts here on where the audience is at. Righty, getting some
Coming
on
fast and
spend,
furious.
getting some on catch and detect anomalies. Sort of interesting. It's almost even
Well, actually,
here.
not really. Yeah, it's a little bit across the board.
Yeah, give it a few more seconds and we'll shut the poll down. Just pick the best one. There won't be a quizness. We will not report this to anybody. I'm just sort of curious what's happened with the audience here. All right, let me go ahead and end the poll and show the results. Go ahead and share those results. I think you can see them.
Yep.
All right. So it looks like a lot of what we have is proactively looking ahead. Well, that sounds like a lot of good conversations here. Next is catching and detecting anomalies. Then we have allocation of spend. We have some for stopping churn and growing lifetime value. And we've got a portion who really aren't in using it just at this time here. So go ahead and stop sharing that.
Oops. Well, stop sharing. Hold on.
Yeah, you
There we
stop
go.
sharing that. Let me go to
Yep,
the
it's
next
gone.
here. All right. All right. As we said, it's been a problem solver for a century. So let's talk about there's Kenny. Well, you want to talk about some of these categories here? Like, let's talk
Sure.
about let's talk about churn and LTV and why that's important.
What's that? Yeah,
So
you
let's
want
talk
you want
about
you want to keep your customers coming back. If I can figure
yeah,
out when they're going to leave, that would be a good time to reach out to them,
right.
wouldn't it?
As product managers, we are responsible in some degree for the lifetime value of our product here. That's how we keep the lights on. And so having predictive models to understand when customers might leave us, why they might leave us is helpful for that. Um, Spend and allocation smarter here. We're always seeing that. How can we spend less money and be more productive and better allocate our resources? And that's just, pure acts of prioritization. We want to get out in front of problems early. I think you and I exhausted that one with some of our stories here. But here's one: achieve stability at scale. So again, we want to help again look ahead, do some telemetry there, and of course improve the lives and jobs of others. Any other thoughts on this one here in terms of solving any problems, Kenny?
I think that last one's critical, right? There are opportunities where I can start to predict things and leverage those predictions to actually create better products, better results that people have with
Yeah,
folks.
yeah. So let's go through some of these, all right? And just talk about these, and then we'll get on to the demo and talk about some of that here. But we already see this in our lives. In real life, examples: Netflix. When you go and turn Netflix on, you're always getting recommendations. In fact, that's been one of their staples in how they get their viewing. In fact, 80% of their viewing comes from predictive analytics there. PayPal flags churn from transaction patterns here, which I wasn't aware of here. And again, I think this is really good for taking an opportunity to understand which of those customers are at risk, which of those have basically fallen off from a because in the normal path, especially in product-led growth, you want not only the customer to adopt, you want them to adore the product, and then you want them to become an advocate and evangelizing for your product here. What happens if they start churning out? That doesn't it doesn't start working there. So again, just as you see that in your lives here, stopping churn and growing the lifetime value of your product is going to be really important in how you do that. And there's some inspirational examples. We
And
see
Dean,
it
this
with,
is go back though, and
yeah,
this is
yeah,
it's a
sure.
key one because I think one of the things that people don't realize, right, is it requires two things. One is make sure you collect data on what's
Yes,
happening with your customers, and
yes.
two, right, don't forget people tend to ignore when people leave, and I'm going to stop collecting data when they leave or define it. For this scenario, to do predictive analytics, you need to understand those folks that leave as much as those folks that stay.
I didn't talk about it too much here, but a great predictive analytics strategy means having a great data capture strategy. And you're right. If you're not doing exit interviews, if you're not doing win-loss interviews, if you don't have analytics instrumentation, I would, I've had the opportunity to both work for large enterprises as well as startups. Both of them, in many cases, had similar problems. They didn't collect, they collected analytics on how many button clicks. What they didn't talk about was people dropping off, was people moving, away from adoption, and into atrophy. And so instead of having these people who you want to progress into advocates for your product, they wind up eventually abandoning because they start to atrophy because they don't use it anymore. And then after that, they become what do you call it? They go ahead and abandon the product, and even worse, they could become, like I said, somebody then who advocates against you, as they become a little bit embittered here. So really important to have that sort of data, and it actually helps you as well as when you're making business cases. Spending and allocating smarter here. So Rolls-Royce, keeps those jet engines. By the way, they don't sell those jet engines. They actually lease them, and they only make money when the engine's working, which is good. But and it's not in a maintenance cycle here. So how do they keep, or how do they reduce maintenance cycles on those jet engines that are on the planes that you ride on? And Walmart, they keep the stock shelved, and by and reducing stockouts using predictive inventory as well. So there are some ways in an e-commerce setting or in a maintenance setting or a manufacturing and services setting where predictive analytics can help you avoid those situations where things, for example, you don't want to have all your engines in long maintenance cycles because it's one of those situations, the more you're working on, the less time you have to work on things. And the same thing with having a stock out. Once they start happening and increasing, they sort of start snowballing. So both of these prevent a sort of snowballing type of situation here. Um, Risk detection here. I remember the first time I had my credit card, denied me. I was actually on a business trip to Malaysia and I went to buy something here, and it was like, sorry, this card doesn't work. And I'm like, what do you mean this card doesn't work? Not realizing that good old Bank of America was like, wait a minute, don't you live in Apex? What the heck are you doing? So I was way outside the pattern. Didn't realize that I would start traveling a lot there. And so, I mean, it was a pain, but understanding that it was, preventing the alternative there. ABB, which provides a lot of electrical and service components here. I mean, they help factories and windmills and robots and even ships from breaking down by getting out ahead of some of these things that happen in the future here. So again, lots of opportunities here to create a lot of customer delight and value by looking at these different approaches to predictive analytics. The same thing with looking into the future, all right, with proactive telemetry here. Microsoft Azure, I mentioned that before when I was at a Primo. One of the things we did is we put all sorts of probes out into our cloud space here, where we were detecting signals, and it got to the point where we actually cut down escalations from customers 50% because we were able to get out in front of the problems here. In other words, we were able to see things like, oh, wow, we got a server rolling over, or something in the new release, or we're seeing a lot of frustration happening. We're seeing people not complete these workflows with with relative consistency. So again, we were able to do that. And I think Uber uses that on the other side with their dynamic pricing. It's like there's some wonderful studies of what happens on New Year's Eve, with pricing there.
So I have a good story about that one, Dean. Everybody seems to hate Uber for their dynamic pricing,
Yeah.
right? Why do we have surges? What's going on here? Why do I have to pay more for Uber? Well, guess what? They're actually serving the customer to do that,
Yep.
right? Because what would happen if they didn't have dynamic pricing? Turns out that a lot of Uber drivers will only drive when they see the price at a certain level, right? So when it's New Year's and you're trying to find your Uber driver at a certain time, if we didn't have surge pricing, if we didn't have that happening with their demand spikes, you wouldn't be able to find a ride, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
next time you complain about surge pricing, realize that what's happening is they're meeting the demand by increasing the price to meet that demand.
Yep. There you go. So you're looking at, and then finally just bringing delight. At IQVIA, where I worked, we use predictive analytics to keep people alive during the clinical trial process, not small potatoes. We had that question earlier about deterministic. Trust me, you did not want a generative AI system when you're trying to match patients to clinical trials or trying to project how many participants you would have for a particular clinical trial. Kenny, you want to guess what the average cost when a clinical trial for a new therapy stalls for a day? Do you want
Yeah.
you want to guess at the range of the cost depending on the size of the study, the average costs
For a day? I
per
don't know,
day?
between 10,000 and 100,000?
Like I got a little higher here. It depends. If it's a small study, it gets 300,000, and if it's a large one, it's $3 million
Oof.
a day. Yeah,
Wow.
so you definitely want to use predictive analytics to, yeah, and also you want some better outcomes. So quite a bit of work is happening in the area of life sciences, where all this data we've collected over the years is now being used either to create new therapies, to create better outcomes, to give better advice and counseling. And again, you want something that's data informed, especially when we're talking about our health here. We don't want to sit there and screw around with proximity and probabilities. We want to know it's there. Disney does that. Are you familiar with the Disney story? I imagine you are, Kenny. If not,
Nope.
oh, so when you get one of those, so especially if you got those little what do you call it, the wristband things there. Oh yeah, they've got all sorts of predictive analytics. That's how they get Goofy to pop out of nowhere. Uh, or Cinderella to show up out of nowhere, or to take care of. There's all sorts of stories of how they're able to sit there and get out in front and create delight for customers, based off of patterns that they have in the past there. So just again, so on either extreme here, that we're creating either better outcomes or creating delight here. But what about 2026? I mean, we're talking about predictive analytics, so let's get some predictions for 2026 here. And some of the emerging trends I want to talk about here are basically, uh, things like Tesla, where they're using predictions to create safety guardrails. Now, notice that term safety guardrails. What do you suppose predictive guardrails and dynamic guardrails might be important to the future, especially if we're always focused on things like generative AI and agents? Any thoughts, Kenny?
Yeah, we don't want to run into people, do we?
Well, we don't. And we want our agents to run like those self-driving cars. I mean, look, agents was the big thing in 2025. Herding the agent cats is going to be the big thing in 2020. I'm predicting that for the future already. One of the big things in 2026 is, oh crap, we've got hundreds of agents everywhere and no way to herd these cats. And also no way to understand that if all this autonomy is actually working, because if you're working in an agentic system, what do you need? You need to give it autonomy, but you also need to give it accountability. And you do that through guidelines and guardrails. Part of that is done through constitutional governance, but part of that, if you can dynamically keep feeding it the right guardrails based off the conditions here, you can create safer, more durable, more reliable agent products there. Um, I think, again, tools like Salesforce, where it's going to just help us with, again, as we start creating communications using generative tools. Well, what if we could feed it predictions or feed it customizations based off of these predictive patterns? Think about how much more impactful. So it doesn't come across like this just generic, like, hey, look, I was written by ChatGPT, come buy my product, but actually speaks to people and their needs there. I think it's going to help us as we vibe code in the future, where it can actually help define some of the things we're doing as well. And I also think, like, it's going to help us when we realize that we can use different modalities together here, that we can use predictive with generative, with other types of AI. And I think, 80% of what goes out the door in terms of AI these days isn't creating any lift. And I think part of it is we've gotten ourselves a little bit myopic and not understanding, first of all, it's not either or. You may want to use a hybrid combination. So how do we start using these technologies together? Curious if you have any thoughts on that in terms of where the future might be going here, Kenny.
No, I think uh, part of it is, we hear about some of these agents going haywire, right? And I guess
Right.
back to your point on deterministic, right? If we get way too creative, then and they start to feed on one another, how do we rope that in? How do we make sure that some of those agents aren't going crazy and putting in some of those guardrails of checkpoints, right? And then using the data from that checkpoints to set up what our prediction of the next checkpoint ought to be, I think we'll have a better solution.
Yeah, absolutely there. In fact, speaking of guardrails, right? I mean, these are, questions that every product manager needs to ask and needs to consider here. This gets to your point earlier, Kenny.
Yeah.
Is your data complete? We can talk about AI, all day long here. We could just, turn this webinar to a live stream, and Kenny and I could talk, just, what do you call it? Kick the can down around on this topic here, but it all gets to the data. It is the
Okay.
lifeblood. So, what is your current data store? Do you even know what your data strategy is, your organization? Have you made friends with people in data science? Because I know they're a little wired a little different. Okay, and when you're trying to get something done, they make your future hostage negotiations a little bit dicey here. But you need to start understanding the nature of your data. And that's not just for predictive analytics. That's for any type of AI you're going to do. Trust is going to be another issue in 2026 that I think is going to keep surfacing, especially as we see more agents go into an agentic type of framework, especially as we see more things vibe coded, especially as we start seeing things move a little faster here. I think trust is going to become an even bigger. This gets back into deterministic.
Mm.
I like to tell people is like, okay, so you're writing an agentic system, which is a series of 7 agents firing off. What happens a year from now when the lawyer has a conversation with you and saying, like, well, why didn't subagent number 4 get the context right? And why did it all of a sudden turn this workflow into a game of telephone, which what was intended at the beginning isn't what happened at the end? And how are we going to sit there and, write all these evals? Are we just going to sit there and sort of wordsmith them out of thin air? I don't think so. So again, you've got tools like predictive analytics that can help you do that. But again, you have to have your data strategy, and then I think also an understanding what problem we're solving, who we're solving it for, and perhaps even what your competitive advantage might be. One of the advantages of predictive analytics for me is you can run simulations, and it's not that now it's not. In fact, we're going to show some of that. It's not that hard to run simulations. It's not that hard to do this anymore. It used to be very expensive to set these up. It used to, there's a lot of cost and a lot of lift. You had to sell your firstborn child to your favorite data scientist or PhD student and what do you call it, neuroscience. You don't have to do that anymore. All right, so getting that done is a lot easier. And then you need to consider some things here as well. All right. I mean, understand the user and their expectations especially with AI products here. Because, like I said, the dirty little secret is there's a lot of people who just don't trust it. And after 3 years of cheap, ubiquitous, non-deterministic AI, they don't trust it even more here. But also, as you're doing these feature hostage negotiations, as you're doing stakeholder shuttle diplomacy, as you're trying to herd these dangerous animals of product management, it wouldn't hurt to have some data informed predictions, some actual math, even if it's just on a Excel. That's how cheap predictive analytics has come. You can actually do it on the Excel spreadsheets now. And they even have the math library, so you don't even have to, go out and look for macros to run anymore. What if you could use data from your own organization? I'm like, hey, we built a product similar to this. Here's how it trended. Here's how it did. Um, and like I said, the other thing you're going to need to do is educate people on what predictive analytics are. And you're like, well, why? Why do I need to do that here? And I think part of it is, like I said, a lot of people are looking at AI through a bit of a myopic lens here. I think they've forgotten some of the things we've done for ages. I think they've forgotten that, this predictive analytics has been around with us for decades, if not centuries. So on that, any other thoughts on questions to ask or items to consider from the product management point of view, Kenny?
So one question that I'm thinking of is if let's say I'm working in an organization that isn't very good at collecting and data from our customers or from our products,
Yeah.
how do I start to prioritize what data I should start collecting, right? Because it's expensive, it's expensive to set up the systems to go collect that data. How do I know? How do I know and figure out what kind of data I might need rather than just collect
Yeah,
everything?
that's a good question here. I think it's going to lead us into what we're going to. In fact, why don't we go into head into the demos here?
Okay.
Because you're starting to get into the area of like, all right, I don't have or have data, or I don't have data, or I've got some of this, but I don't really know what I'm talking about. So, here Kenny and I have talked a good show about this, but how do we get your hands on? So I'm going to go walk through a few tabs here on a few technologies here. And the first one here, and I'm going to go ahead and give you these links. Let me give you these links right now in the chat. I copy them. Where's the chat? Here we go. Here's all the links in order. Give me a second. There you go.
So
So,
why you do that, Dean? There's a question that came from the crowd that I think might fit in here, right?
yes.
If I'm a product manager, do I need to become proficient in things like Power BI and SQL?
Um, we used to say you needed to be, AI literate. But I think in 2026 and moving forward, you're going to have to become a little bit more fluent. Do you have to become an expert? Probably not an expert, but you're going to have some level of proficiency. All right. You're going to want to survive. I don't think the links came out here. Well, that's
No,
just
they did not.
no. Well, that just broke my heart there. I worked so hard on these. All right, we'll get these links over to you somehow. But yeah. So I think to that question here is, do I have to become? I do think you need to get hands on with some of this. Now, you don't need to know every tool. All right, you don't need to know every method here, but you at least need to have some survivability, having first contact with people here. So when they talk about it in a let's say Power BI is popular where you're at. I don't think it hurts to understand what can happen in terms of predictive analytics and some other items there when you're talking about things like the operational model here. All right. Yeah. So we'll add the links into the email. So I think, get up your proficiency a little bit more here. I mean, it's the same thing with some of these AI tools. I'm not saying you have to become an expert in all of them, but you do have to understand the approach. And now here's the thing. Power BI, Tableau, I mean, there's all sorts of other tools out here. And really for me, it's the approach that you have to learn. So I don't need you to learn every keystroke of Power BI. What I need you to be able to do is attack or approach a predictive analytics problem in whatever tool you're using. Think of it like you're playing American baseball. Everyone learns how to swing a bat. Now you can tell the amateur because when they strike and swing and miss, they look at their bat like it's the problem. And I've seen product managers look at Power BI and Tableau like it was the offender, when in fact that person had a terrible approach to, getting into the on deck circle, warming up, taking practice swings, getting into the batter's box, digging in, anticipating the ball. And I think the same thing happens with these tools. Our approach is really, we don't have an approach. We don't have, and so whether it's Power BI today or some other tool like Kibana tomorrow, you need to be able to, work on your approach to those. So just keep that in mind. Now, here's an interesting site analyzing time series data here. So if you're curious, one of the heart and soul of predictive analytics is time series data. Now, time series data is interesting here because basically it's capturing slices of data. I've done a lot of work with industrial IoT, and it's sending signals constantly. And so, first of all, you have to understand that if one of the ways you're talking about it, Kenny, is how do I capture data? Well, one of the ways we used to do it would be to set up a device to simulate like these IoT devices and just start basically cranking out these time series events and capturing them in another computer, and understanding that once you get these time series events on the temperature, on the pressure, on the frequency, or whatever these sensors are capturing here, that's one way you can synthesize the data here. So again, and so I wanted to share this source with you first because I thought this was a really good source here by the people of at observability here on analyzing time series data. And I think if you're curious about learning more about how predictive analytics works in that context, that's helpful. Then you of course reminded me of Streamlit, Kenny, which is a wonderful community of data scientists and engineers who are doing all sorts of things with data. Okay. One here that I always thought was really interesting is they use synthetic patient data. So this is something we did at IQVIA too. We didn't have patient data. So how do you do it? Well, there's places and ways of creating what they call synthetic data. And if you can create synthetic data, you can nudge it and start understanding, okay, what is it that we actually have to capture? What is it that we're actually taking from the devices here? And then this was on patient volume trends in terms of admissions to a particular hospital. And with that, they were able to see trends, but they are also able to predict future forecasts both on time of year, both on whether it's seasonal or not. And so imagine that. How many physicians do I need? How many doctors do I need? How many what do you call it, nurses do I need? How many people with the janitorial staff do I need? So again, all these just using patient data able to capture that. And the nice thing about our friends here at Streamlit is that these are all open source models that you can look at. So I'll share this one here. The one you shared with me was this customer churn,
Yeah.
which I thought was really cool. This was really well done. By the way, they've even forked it over on GitHub. So you can actually, if you want, you can jump out to GitHub and get all the code. So they just, here's the data. And then, and so again, you can play with the data here. This actually is really nice that you could take this model very quickly and leverage it in other ways. But it shows you the data, what it looks like, and then you can go play with the data. It gives you different visualizations. So, for example, here we're thinking like, oh, you know what? I don't know. When I look, for example, when I look at this churn rate here, I'm not happy. I mean, if I'm a product, if I'm a director of product or head of product, I'm probably going to get a little grumpy when I see that number because I want it down to 5%. I don't know. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, we're running about 15% there. That's not cool.
Yeah, that's not healthy. Yeah, that's a good way of running out of runway really fast. And then there's, predictions they can run as well that, so you can play with the model that way. So really, really awesome little, again, way of learning and exploring this more. I'll share that link. For goodness sake. Let me try capturing that one more time. Here we go. And then we share it here to everybody. So here's another link here. Now, as we talk about that, I was looking at this site here called Grafana, all right? And I thought this was a really interesting site here because it's an open source site for playing with observability. And so it gives you a lot of different, and it has a playground that you can explore. You can explore data, you can look at different models. For example, there's a bunch of models here and data source examples here and open source data. And so you can look at things like, on this one here, all right, this is wind farm power. Now you have enough data here where you can actually drive a prediction. Or you have these, let's say you're talking about your uptime on your SaaS product here. Again, these are ways of learning your way through this. So some really interesting tools. I like this one because of its simplicity here. This is this time, whoops, wrong leg. Time series playground here. And this was talking about international airline passengers. And then look, a little bit of a prediction here. Now, again, this was just projecting here, and it's just doing historical view here. But I thought it was an interesting way if you're looking to learn about it more. It gives you the math behind it here. So this is where you got to make some friends with someone in data science and stat, and get. But here's the nice thing
Peace.
here. They also link to this awesome book here on principles and practices on forecasting. Forecasting is another word for predictive analytics. Now, I decided, hey, why don't we go ahead and mix generative AI with predictive analytics and see what we get here? So I went and found an IIoT model of data. So this is the RMC 1000, and so if it's a unit, it's basically we call it edge device unit that takes IoT data from different sources and then emanates it out. So if imagine you're on a factory floor, you're running windmill turbines, you're trying to do shipping lanes, any of that big type of work here. How can we take the data and go ahead and, to your question, Kenny, create synthetic data to understand the nature of the data so we can understand what data we need to start collecting. So, long way to your answer, but I appreciate the patience here, right? So, I decided I was going to do it in ChatGPT. I gave it the PDF. I said, hey, which one of these JSON data structures would be great for predictive analytics, for a factory floor? And it gave me a good I felt was a fair recommendation here. And it told me why, the information here. And then I sat there and asked it the question, well, this is great. Why don't we create some synthetic data? In other words, create records. And oh, by the way, inject some anomalies. All right. Because that's where life gets interesting, right? And it basically created a bunch of data here. I asked it how much data so it basically created a month's worth of data with about, which is good enough for a prototype. All right. It's good enough for a proof of concept. I wouldn't go to production with this. I said, hey, that's really good. Could you go ahead and take this synthetic data you created based off this real world IoT device and run a simulation for a month? And then let's go ahead and create a dashboard, in the canvas so we can actually see some of the data and some of the predictions here. And I thought that was interesting. I said, you know what? I think what would happen if I did that in Gemini? Same process. This is the end game it gave me here. So at the very end, it actually gave me something very interesting here because it gave me all these different types of charts here to look at here. And I thought that was really interesting here. Let me go a little bit larger here. So again, and it actually gives us some nice predictors here. Let me get a little larger just for the folks here. Here we go. So like with motor temperature here. All right. So again, some interesting things to do with that. And I think that's all I have to demo for today. I think it's time for a poll. Starting
Great.
today,
Let's do
what
that.
would you do differently? Here's the poll.
Feel free to click on them. There you go.
People scheduling coffee with their data scientists. That's always a good
That's
thing
a
to
good thing
do.
to do. Buy them coffee. They can help you.
You don't want them too caffeinated. Just
You might.
no, for private, for personal experience. Yeah, keep. All right, so looks like some people are going to be looking to create Slack alerts. Let me go
Let's
ahead
share it.
and
Let's share it. Yeah, I
yeah,
shared
share.
it.
Yeah, stop sharing. All right, so looks like some people are going to be looking at some Slack anomalies. Some people are going to look at their products time series data. That's a good thing. All right, and then schedule coffee here. So Ken, I think we want to
Okay,
leave
so a
people
couple of
with.
things. Yeah, so I can do my little piece here. One is we've got some training coming up in New York next month. So if you're interested or near New York, click on this QR code here, and you can get a special offer related to our training that we're doing live in-person training we're doing in New York City. If you want to get your mini MBA from Productside, go click there.
That's not all.
That's not all. We've got enough more webinars coming up. So I'm working with Roger Schneider on a webinar in a couple of weeks, October 8th. So if you've got product managers and product owners and know that there's some challenges on how you work between the two of them, um, click on this one. Yeah, click on this QR code, sign
Yeah,
up, and you'll learn. You'll get some couples counseling.
yeah, I might have to call in proxy of some situations I work with that as well there as well. But that's not all.
Yeah, there's more courses coming. There's a course starting next week that says it's with Tom Evans. It's not, it's with me on AI and how to work with AI. And then Dean's going to do some teaching in October online. Roger's going to do some teaching in November. Some more if you're interested in AI. And then, as I mentioned, so we've got two live in-person courses happening, one in October in New York. And then if you happen to be near the Austin, Texas area in December, you can be trained by our own Tom Evans. So
Cool.
go to the website of Productside if you're interested in some of our course offerings and want to learn more about predictive analytics, AI, or general product management and concepts around there.
Yep, there you go. And I think if there's any questions, let's field them.
Yeah. So if there are questions, go put them in the QA panel, put them in the chat panel. We'll answer them either way, and make an understanding how they do that. So I'll wait to see if any questions come up. I may have one or two that
Go ahead, hit
I've
me with
come
your
up
best
with.
shot.
Yeah. So in a world of AI, right? How do I know whether I should use predictive analytics or just throw it into ChatGPT and make that happen for me?
Yeah, and like I said, I don't have a problem with people just looking around, as you to answer your question, where do I start? I don't have a person using generative to help shape that question. Like I said, I took a specification and I basically within minutes vibe coded, a dashboard, sort of a dashboardy like thing. But I think when you're going towards production, I think that's where you need to have conversations with people in engineering. You have to need people with data engineering and data science, because at that point, it's like, all right, look, this is really going to be data intensive. This is not predictive and probabilistic. We actually want this to be, nearly verbatim here. And so we need to make sure our data, we have the right data, that the data is clean, that the data is featurized. There's a series of steps that have to happen, and you need to be aware of the lift that's going to take at the scale. Now, again, the payoff is big. There's 82 billion in opportunities for predictive analytics in the coming year, but those are questions you need to start addressing there. Again, this is not something you're going to do on your own as a product manager. You are going to have to make friends and influence people. Like I learned at IQVIA, my product trio turned into a product quartet, where it was me, a person in design, person in engineering, and a data scientist as part of the group there. So if you've got those capabilities, if not, you can use generative tools to help teach your way into it. But at the end of the day, you still need to have an understanding of how these predictive tools are different, how they give you more trust, how they keep you out of problems, keep you away from situations too. You don't want to predict things and then cause either a safety issue or an issue with lawyers. So again, need to understand what some of the risks are as well.
Great. Dean, I think we've hit the top of the hour. So,
You have.
and
So
any
thanks,
final
folks.
thoughts before we sign off?
I just like, hey, don't, generative AI is not the only game in town. So, learn it, take advantage of it, and build some great products from it.
Great. Thanks so much. Enjoy,
Thanks
folks.
all.